The Industrial Revolution changed many aspects of society, especially primary education. Before the Industrial Revolution, common people received no state-sponsored education. High rates of illiteracy were very common, even in Western countries. Education wasn't universal, so a family would have to be fairly wealthy to acquire an education for their children. Only the children of the elite had access to education. With the exception of enlightened rulers such as Empress Maria Theresa and Catherine the Great of Russia, governments did not provide widespread public education. It was not until the 1870s that state-sponsored free schooling was seriously implemented in European countries. However, the lack of education wasn't just based on availability of education. Most lives still revolved around agriculture and self-sustenance. Families needed their children to help make food and stay alive. Sending kids to school instead of to the fields was simply impractical. Unfortunately, education was an afterthought for most families, whether they had access to it or not. During the 19th century, mandatory education gained the interest of the church and most European governments. After 1881, schooling was compulsory in England for boys and girls between 5 and 10 years old. By the end of the 19th century, literacy had increased steadily in most areas of Europe and the United States, thanks to a new appreciation for education.
Educational movements in France and Britain began in the 1850s, the purpose being the opportunity for particularly poor children to go to school. These schools taught practical skills as well as religious teachings. The schools, called Ragged Schools, were initially founded by the London City Mission, a group of Christian missionaries who came together to provide free education for the growing population of the destitute poor. Following its creation, it received large donations from a prominent reforming conservative. The Ragged School Union tried to incorporate various private efforts such as the London City Missions in a network of schools that could be supplied by charity or by state-sponsored. The transition from religious schools to state schools may have impeded state-sponsored education. There was still a debate about whether or not education should be public or private. Inspections of ragged schools mandated by the 1857 Industrial Schools Act led Parliament to conclude after several decades that the informal system of ragged schools would not suffice, and that universal education was necessary. This was apparent from the statistics. Only a fraction of London's 500,000 children attended ragged schools consistently, and few derived a tangible benefit from it. In America, education reform was divided in the North and the South. The case for universal government-sponsored education in the North was that factory workers should have been educated. The resistance to centralized education in the North was founded on the concerns of religious bias, that Protestant values taught in schools were not purely altruistic, but had the goal of forcefully assimilating immigrants and non-Protestants. This occurred in the midst of a changing political landscape. The Protestant elite saw a threat to their influence coming from the influx of migrant workers and immigrants. In the South, the same factors that enabled education reforms in the North, manufacturing and urbanization, did not occur, namely because of slavery. Schooling followed social stratifications. Rich whites sent their sons to academies, poor whites were provided with religious education, and slaves were not educated at all. Free blacks were educated by progressive Quakers. Education reforms did not occur within a larger movement until sometime after the Civil War.
In Britain, legislation was slowly but steadily being passed so that each child received an education. In 1833, the Factory Act was passed, mandating that each child that worked in a factory received 2 hours of schooling per day. In 1870, new public boarding schools funded by the state were set up by Forster's Act. The 1880 Education Act made school attendance required until a child was 10 years old. Finally, the 1902 Education Act established a secondary school system. Each of these laws required government funding and planning and represented a major step towards the inclusion of every child of every background in the educational system. Some of these laws, however, weren't always enforced. It took a while for each of these new laws to actually get obeyed. Mostly they were just technicalities. Additionally, there were very few systems to make sure that students were actually learning and not falling behind. There was no required curriculum, although certain classes like reading, math, and Bible study were most common. One Royal Commission investigator said, "There may perhaps be 1 or 2 cases in which under unpromising circumstances, a boy or girl has derived benefit from a ragged school, though I admit that I have been unable to discover any.
In short, the Industrial Revolution brought about a lot of positive changes to education, especially in public schooling. This meant things like government-funded schools and mandatory attendance. Although these changes and many more benefited the lives of the masses, there were still issues to be found that would take many more years to be corrected. The Industrial Revolution created tons of great laws and opportunities, but those laws still had a way to go.
Here is an 1851 children's rhyme book from a ragged school. Children at the school would use this book to learn basic reading skills.